Jews have been storytellers for over 3,000 years.
But what does Jewish storytelling look like today?
I'm Stephen Smith.
And I'm Heather Smith.
Welcome to Our Jewish Story, the podcast where we explore the traditions of Jewish narrative, why capturing contemporary stories matters now more than ever. We also share voices from the Our Jewish Story archive.
Real people, real stories, the full mosaic of Jewish life.
This is Our Jewish Story. So, let's get started.
Hi, I'm Heather Smith, and this is Our Jewish Story. Today I want to talk to you about something that's really close to my heart, and something that's actually the foundation of everything we're building. It starts with a question. Well, actually, it starts with questions. And what happens to people when they get to ask their own question? So let me take you back to something I noticed a few years ago, and I think a lot of you will relate to this. Think back to being at a lecture or a speaker event, and you're sitting there listening. It's fine, it's interesting, but then something shifts. The speaker finishes their prepared remarks and says, okay, we have time for a few questions. And suddenly the energy in the room completely changes. People sit up, they lean forward. You can feel the attention sharpen, and everyone's engaged in a different way than they were 5 minutes earlier. I started noticing a few things years ago, and it fascinated me. Why does the Q&A feel so different? Why are people willing to stay around longer after the event to ask their own questions? And here's the thing I realized. There's never enough time for it. Speakers always leave, 10 minutes at the end, and everybody's frustrated because they didn't get to ask their question. And some are even willing to stay longer in the hopes of asking the speaker their question. But because everyone wants to ask their own question, not really hear someone else's question answered, because we all have our own. And there's something powerful about that. When you ask your own question, you're not passively receiving information anymore. You're connecting with the material in a way that's personal to you. Your question comes from what you're curious about or from your experience and what you're trying to make sense of. And that creates a completely different kind of learning. It's actually been studied. Asking your own questions leads to better retention, deeper engagement, and a more meaningful connection to whatever you're learning. It's not just a feeling. It's how our brains work. So I tucked that observation away, and then around 2010, it came up in a big way. At that time, Stephen, my husband, was working at USC Shoah Foundation, and we were both noticing something that worried us. The Holocaust survivors were aging. For decades, survivors have been going into classrooms, speaking to students, sharing their stories, and there's nothing quite like sitting in a room with someone who lived through that history. The students would listen. You could hear a pin drop. And then when they'd start asking the questions and answer part, the room's energy changed. Everyone was suddenly energized to ask their own question. They'd raise their hands in the hopes that they would be picked to ask one of the 3 or 4 questions asked of the survivor. And those conversations, those direct exchanges, they were learning, real learning happening. That's where the real connections were made. By 2010, many survivors were in their 80s and 90s. Some couldn't travel anymore. Some were finding it harder to speak for long periods, and we started to ask ourselves, what happens when they're gone? It wasn't just about preserving their stories. We had thousands of video testimonies already. It was about preserving that experience, the experience of sitting with a survivor, asking them your own questions, the Q&A. The thing that made the engagement so powerful in the first place. That's when the idea came to me. What if we could record survivors in a way that would let people ask them questions, even after they're gone? That desire to replicate the Q&A became a project called Dimensions in Testimony. Now, some of you might have heard of Dimensions in Testimony because it's been in the news because of the technology. We filmed survivors using special cameras so they could appear life-size, almost like holograms, in museums and classrooms. And yes, that's visually impressive. I get it. But here's what I want you to understand. That's not the magic. The magic is in the recorded content, the stories in the first place, enough answers to questions that people ask. They can actually feel as if they can have a conversation or a Q&A session with a Holocaust survivor and ask their own questions about what they're curious about. We sat with survivors for days. We asked them hundreds and hundreds of questions. Every question we could imagine a person might want to ask about their childhood, their friends, their family, how they survived, what they lost, how they dealt with grief after what they had gone through. Everything the survivors wanted young people to learn from their experience. It was literally hundreds of questions. And now those survivors are in museums around the world, in Illinois, in Dallas, in London, and many other places. Students walk in, they can raise their hand and ask a question. And the survivor answers in their own voice, in their own words. It's not scripted. We didn't edit anything the survivors said in their answers to our questions. The students ask their questions, and the system finds the survivor's answer to that question, and they respond. One can ask as many questions as they like, similar to a conversation. And the students, you should see their faces. They're engaged in a way they wouldn't be if they were just watching a documentary, because they asked, they were curious, and someone answered them. The survivors that we interviewed for this special program have reached hundreds of thousands of students, and it works. Not because of the fancy technology or the holographic visualization, but because we preserved the Q&A, because we harnessed the power of curiosity. So here's what I've been thinking about lately. We built Dimensions in Testimony for Holocaust survivors because their stories were in danger of being lost, because time was running out, and that urgency was real. But what about everyone else? What about the millions of ordinary Jewish people whose stories have not been recorded at all? Not just survivors of catastrophe, just Jews living their lives, keeping traditions or not keeping them, making choices about what to pass on, cooking their grandmother's recipes, figuring out what being Jewish means to them and how their Judaism fits into their world and how it affects their values and worldview. And those stories matter too. And they're being lost every single day. Every time someone dies without telling their story, it's gone. Their grandchildren will never know what their voice sounded like, what mattered to them, how they saw the world directly from them, see them or hear them and get a sense of who they were. And I thought, why aren't we doing what we did for Holocaust survivors for ordinary Jewish life today? Why aren't we building an archive where anyone can ask questions about Jewish life and hear real Jewish people answer? That's our Jewish story. So let me tell you what we're building. We're recording Jewish people from all over the world, all backgrounds, all levels of observance, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Orthodox, Reform, conservative, secular, cultural, and everything in between. Israelis and diaspora Jews, people whose families have been Jewish for generations, and people who converted last year. We're asking them questions, all the questions you can imagine about Jewish life, tradition, history, and day-to-day practice. What does being Jewish mean to you? What traditions do you keep? What's your family's migration story? How do you celebrate the holidays, or do you? What's your favorite Jewish food, and why does it matter? What do you want your grandchildren to know? What makes you feel connected to the Jewish people? What makes you feel distant from it? We're building essentially the world's largest Q&A archive of Jewish stories. And then, and this is the important part, anyone can come and ask their own questions. A student in Indonesia who's never met a Jewish person, a curious person in rural Kansas, a young Jew in Buenos Aires trying to figure out their own identity. They can ask a question and real Jewish people will answer in their own words, in their own voices. Now, some people hear this and they immediately think, oh, this is about PR. This is about changing the way the world sees Jews. This is advocacy. And I want to be clear, that's not what this is. We're not curating a message. We're not telling people what to think about Jews. We're not trying to make Jews look good or counter some negative argument or narrative. We're just letting Jews speak for themselves. This is not didactic. It's experiential. It's inquiry-driven. It's curiosity-based. You want to know what Jews are like? Don't read a pamphlet. Don't watch the news. Ask a Jew. Ask 100 Jews. Ask them your questions and hear their answers. And here's the beautiful thing. Jews are so diverse that you'll get 100 different answers because we don't all think alike. We don't all practice alike. We argue about everything. That's the kind of our thing. We question everything. When you hear real Jews answer real questions, the stereotypes fall apart, not because we've crafted a counter message, but because reality is more interesting and more complicated than any stereotype. And this isn't just for non-Jews, and I want to be clear about that. Think about how diverse the Jewish world is. An Orthodox Jew in Brooklyn might know very little about what daily life is like for a secular Israeli. A Reformed Jew in California may never have had the real conversation with a chassid. A young person in London trying to figure out what being Jewish means to them, they could learn so much from hearing how dozens of different people answer that same question. Jews learning from Jews. That's part of this too. Because the Jewish story isn't one story. It's millions of stories. It's a mosaic. And the only way to see that mosaic is to collect enough pieces. One story at a time, one voice at a time, one answer at a time. Somebody asked me the other day, what happens if you build this archive and nobody uses it? And I laughed because honestly, then we have a giant archive of Jewish stories for the future, for generations to come. We've captured life as it's lived right now, in this moment. That has value no matter what. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think people are hungry for this. I think there's a real desire among Jews and non-Jews alike to move beyond stereotypes and actually learn from real people, to be curious, to ask questions, to hear answers. And I think the Q&A model, letting people direct their own learning through their own curiosity, is exactly right for this moment. We're all tired of being told what to think. We want to discover things for ourselves. We want to ask our own questions. That's what our Jewish story offers, the opportunity to be curious and real people ready to answer. So here's my ask. If you're Jewish, tell your story. It matters. It doesn't have to be dramatic or unusual. The everyday stuff is exactly what we need. Your traditions, your choices, your perspective, the way you see the world, that's valuable. That's irreplaceable. And if you don't share it, it's lost. If you're not Jewish, or if you are Jewish, but you want to learn from other Jews, be curious. Ask questions. That's how this works. That's how real understanding happens, not through lectures, not through pamphlets, not through someone telling you what to think, through your own curiosity, meeting real people with real answers. I've spent years thinking about the power of questions, from that first observation in a lecture hall to dimensions in testimony to what we're building now. And I keep coming back to the same truth. People learn better when they're curious, when they ask their own questions, when someone takes the time to answer. That's what we're building, one story at a time, one question at a time. This is our Jewish story, and it needs yours. Thanks for listening. I'm Heather Smith. Be curious, ask questions, and if you have a story to tell, we want to hear it.